Bonjour, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. We've got a wonderful conference going on. Hopefully, some of you were here last night and got to see the movie. It's interesting that I had to come all the way to Montreal to find out about inner city United States and nutrition. And this is swap over. There you go. All right. So thank you. I usually start my talks with a little bit of history, and we'll do so again today. This sad-looking picture here is a picture of the Spanish Flu Epidemic in 1918. And I always show it because that was the last year when you had 675,000 deaths in the United States and 50 million worldwide. That was the last time that heart disease wasn't the leading killer of Americans. Canada has done a little better. It's gotten to the point where if you look all around the world, heart and circulatory disorders are really number one. But in Canada, like many westernized, high-income countries, cancer has overtaken heart disease. Heart disease has gone down. Unfortunately, I live in a place where that isn't true. The United States is the only high-income country where heart disease is still number one. And what makes that yellow ball so big is low and middle-income countries where we've exported our lifestyle and they've adopted it, and they now have heart disease as the number one killer of Americans. I'm going to try to move this back, and okay. So it's a particularly difficult problem for most of the Western world, but some have done better than others. We actually have a large number of African origin people in the United States, about 13%. You have a fair number here in Canada. All over the world, the African origin people have more cardiovascular disease, except in sort of rural Africa where there isn't the Western lifestyle, and there's a little more plant-based nutrition, and things go a lot better. Now, this slide was supposed to brag about how well we've done in cardiology over the years. We've actually developed everything that you've heard about: stents, bypasses, defibrillators, and the like. And about a 70% decrease in cardiovascular mortality has happened in the United States and around the world, except in the lower middle-income countries where it's still on the rise. The hard part of it, though, is that everything we've done in this arena has really been mopping up the floor instead of turning off the faucet. We've actually not done nearly as much on prevention. We're focusing on it now, but now is after 2015, where our Centers for Disease Control said that the drop in mortality has ended, and diabetes and obesity were taking over and increasing the death rate again. The issue of African origin people, pretty much throughout the Western world, is a saga like this one in the United States, where there's more death, more and delayed improvement. So how do we deal with this growing epidemic? Well, first of all, we have to recognize, and it was really good to see this, horrific, sad picture talking about what's happening in the United States and around many areas of the world where the heart attacks and the bypass surgeries, we complain, in the United States, particularly about African American people, but in India, the people getting stents at age 40, the average, if you have any South Asian, which a lot of Canadians have a South Asian origin, average age of bypass surgery in Pakistan is 43 years old. So it's not surprising that if we don't fix our lifestyles, this is going to continue to be a global epidemic. We do have answers. We've compiled a lot of answers, and so that's mopping up the floor instead of turning off the faucet. We're really trying to change that, and so a few months ago we published what we hope is the answer to the cardiovascular disease in the Western world, and that would include our prevention guidelines. It focuses, I was happy to be one of the authors of it, going in the room, getting beaten up by really smart people, trying to tell them what we really need to do about diet and having to negotiate with them to get something reasonable. But if we take a stock of what our risk factors are, the cholesterol, the high blood pressure, how much physical activity we're doing, aspirin was something that we were using a lot for prevention. Turns out the basis wasn't good, so this document actually pushed it down and said if you don't have disease, you don't need aspirin. It's not going to help you. But diabetes, preventing it and controlling it, really important. No one should be smoking, although I saw a lot of people out there smoking. But okay. And of course, diet. And making that argument, I'm going to, even though I was an author, a beaten-up author on this document, I'm going to take issue with that whole idea of fish. If you remove that one thing from it, it's a pretty good recommendation. And that, fruit, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and whole grains. So I'll get into the fish thing in a little bit, but I just want to go through some of the things that we could do for these major risk factors: obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and high cholesterol. This is obviously a growing problem all over the United States, all over the Western world. I was lecturing in Germany, and of course I looked up the data and found out that Germany is now the most obese country in Europe. This is something that is all over, and it has to do with this. It's portion size. You go to France, you see a lot of smoking. Their heart disease is about a little bit less than the United States. Why? Because there's not a lot of obesity. People are walking, smoking, smoking. And portion size. If I could emphasize just one thing, it would be portion size that a lot of the European countries don't do, except Germany and then, of course, the United States. And so the fast food really pushes portion size. That's how they make sales. So it does result in ethnic disparities in obesity. Hispanic women, African American women in the United States are really have a lot of this. And when we look at dietary interventions, because everybody's talking about trying to do some sort of dietary intervention, there actually is a lot of data from a lot of places, and they all look about the same until you look at long term. And you could try everything you like to do, but the best way of getting around it is to eat plants. And if you're eating plants and not too much, you're going to lose weight if you're obese, and you will maintain that weight loss over a longer period of time. It really has to do with calorie density. My friend Juliana Hever put this out years ago. The fat you eat is the fat you wear, meaning it's just that when you're eating oil, you're eating a large amount of calories. The same is true of animal flesh. And when you're doing vegetables, you can actually get a lot of space taken up in your stomach, get that feeling that you've eaten a lot, and yet you haven't eaten that many calories. So I'm going to focus on diabetes and hypertension because we have a unique relationship between those disorders and cardiovascular death, and on the opposite side, what we can do with diet. A lot of this data comes from the Adventist health studies, where they tell people from their church pulpit that they should do a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet. I know after years and years of research, mostly by Gary Fraser, they wish that they had told them to not eat any animal products at all, because their data showing these 5 different types of diet are completely different. The only group in the Adventists that isn't overweight, defined as a body mass index of more than 25, is the vegan group. They have the lowest amount of diabetes, the lowest amount of hypertension, and sure enough, if you look at their mortality data, the lowest amount of death. And it's about a 30% reduction in death, and the age changes in diet. They've actually published this recently, that the number of people who are doing that standard diet, full of animal products, is going down, down, down as people age, and the number of people doing plant-based. And part of it is the death of the people who are eating the bad diet, and part of it is the fact that people will have an event and they'll switch over because somebody like you will tell them the importance of doing plant-based nutrition for their health. They adopt it and don't go back. So they actually do have good outcome studies showing that if you're a man and you decide not to be a vegetarian, you're giving up probably around 10 years. You're going to be heavier. You're not going to avoid the diabetes and hypertension. And you're not going to have as fulfilling a life because you're not going to get around and do the things that you'd like to do. So many people say, everything in moderation. Well, that turns out to be true. That is, if you moderate the amount of animal products you're eating, you moderate the amount of prolongation of your life. And so you get to choose how many of those 10 years you want to keep. Let's talk about blood pressure for a moment. As we have a lot of data, and you look at massive amounts of medical literature summarized on this slide, how much blood pressure difference can you drop? And it says if you develop high blood pressure and go to a doctor and you know your blood pressure is 150 and you get 20 millimeters off your blood pressure, your doctor's so happy you're finally at goal, it's great. Well, suppose you could do almost that same thing with plant-based nutrition. And there are studies, mostly the vegan studies, where you get rid of all of the animal products and your blood pressure drops. That has been incorporated into our most recent American College of Cardiology, American Heart Association guidelines, along with physical activity, 4 millimeters, decreasing the amount of alcohol you're doing, another 4 millimeters, losing weight, 4 or 5 millimeters, cutting the sodium, really important because this is a problem for some of our vegan community to get the taste up. They put a lot of sodium in, not really healthy for you, will raise your blood pressure if you're susceptible. And then the dietary intake of potassium needs to go up. Now, vegetarians don't usually have a problem with potassium. It's usually massive amounts because of the potassium naturally in the foods. But in green and bold there is the diet rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and whole fat. It's interesting that low-fat dairy is included because even though I was on the committee and pushing these guidelines, the data actually did include, that's the DASH diet, which I'll show you here. The DASH diet did include low-fat dairy. The interesting part is there were people in the DASH diet who didn't do the dairy, the very low-fat, low-cholesterol diet, and that's the one in red, that had the biggest drop in the blood pressure. So we can say very confidently that eliminating the majority or all animals is what's going to drop your blood pressure. I'm going to talk about sugar and sweeteners, and I didn't get a chance other than the movie last night to go out and see what's out there. But I can tell you that if there isn't a lot of sugar out there, this will be the first veggie fest that I've been to where there isn't the, the veggie ice cream and the veggie, brownies and everything. So I'm hoping that you'll take a good look at this and modulate your behavior out there. Unless you really want sugar-free. Is that, no? No, probably not. Okay. So the interesting thing for cardiovascular disease is you really need to just have a handle on a few things, sodium, saturated fat, cholesterol, but one of them is insulin. And what makes our population, when they get overweight, so ill is to become insulin resistant. And in order to, once they have a lot of fat cells, they have to raise their insulin levels to try to get the fat cells to respond because they are insulin resistant. And if you don't have any weight in your belly, you're going to be fine. If you accumulate weight in the belly, it's going to be a problem. So any kind of sugar, including fruit sugar, can raise your insulin levels, and it's going to make you grow in places that you may not want to grow. Okay, so this is the relationship between sugar, fruit sugar, and fiber, and it sort of puts us in perspective. It's kind of like I had to put grapes in a salad now, and I all of a sudden like blackberries and raspberries. I hated them before, but now that I know that they're actually good in terms of that fiber to sugar ratio. If we dose ourselves with sugar, and it really doesn't matter whether it's glucose, sucrose, fructose, that's table sugar, the natural sugars that occur in some plants, or just plain refined flour like white bread, this will result in a significant insulin rise. That insulin rise is going to raise your triglyceride levels in the bloodstream. It's going to lead to more glucose intolerance and diabetes, raise the blood pressure, and increase plaque in arteries. So if we could just stop that one thing, we would be so much better off. And people will actually ask, and people have asked over the last few years, whether or not a sugar-eating vegetarian is better off than someone who's eating animal products and doesn't eat sugar. And there actually is some data. I'll show it to you. So first of all, this one from the Journal of American Medical Association a few years ago indicated very clearly that the more sugar you eat, the more you die. And it's a curvilinear relationship. So hopefully nobody's getting 20% of their calories from added sugar. The first one it's not a direct comparison. It's not a prospective trial, but it's Nurses Health where in the United States, advertised by the Harvard group, where they actually looked at what is it that makes nurses die, the competing risks analysis. And of course, I would have thought, oh, it's smoking. From the time frame that they were doing it, the 1960s to 2000, or 1980s to 2004, I would have thought smoking. Smoking came in third. The first thing that made nurses die was getting old. Okay, probably should have thought of that. The second one was actually diabetes, and smoking came in third. But the really interesting part for our discussion today of sort of meat versus sugar, let's take a look at it. What this slide in terms of hazard ratio is saying, 0.84 is a 16% decrease in mortality if you're eating more fiber, more vegetable fiber, okay? 17% increase in mortality if you take a cholesterol load, like a pork chop. But the point estimate was worse for sugar. So going to Dunkin' Donuts and having that glazed donut was actually worse than eating animal products. So that was the first hint. That was published like 2010, and I think most of us just thought it was just random statistics, doesn't really mean anything. But then we've gotten more and more data about the risk of mortality and in both sugar-sweetened and artificially sweetened beverages. And the assumption is that it does relate to insulin. And unlike what most people think, when you're using an artificial sweetener, since it's artificial, therefore it's not going to increase your insulin level, almost all of them do. There's only two that I know of that I've looked up extensively that don't increase insulin levels, and that's erythritol and yacon syrup. Yacon is like a root from South America, so if you're really into the sugar sweeteners, you probably want to switch over. So the increase in mortality with artificial sweeteners is actually only about 13%, but with sugar in this one study was 31%. If we take a look at diabetes, which is so prevalent and driving the increase in cardiovascular disease, we really can make a big difference by getting rid of the refined carbohydrates, saturated fat, getting rid of red meat and particularly processed red meat. And this is a unique relationship that isn't completely understood. There are probably so many factors that lead into it, but it really isn't just about eating meat and getting overweight that makes you diabetic. It's just the properties of the animal products biochemically that produce the diabetes. So if you wanted to get rid of it, it actually is pretty easy. You just stop eating red meat. You don't do any animal products at all. You keep the diet low in saturated fat and substitute polyunsaturated fat for sugar, and you will do substantially better. Now, have there been prospective trials? There actually are. And so if you look at observational data and prospective data, it's pretty clear that this relationship between diet and diabetes is a unique relationship that we should take advantage of for our patients, for ourselves, for our family. This is several studies summarized. You take all this data and put them into a statistical model, and this is what you come up with. The more what this is saying is that the more plants you eat, your risk for diabetes plummets. Okay? So if I don't see anybody taking pictures of that one. But nobody knows anyone who's diabetic. I must not be in Mexico or the United States. Right? Yes. Okay. All right. The last one about diabetes is this one. We were expecting that when you do plant-based diet that you can actually intervene prospectively and make things better. Well, guess what? It doesn't just control your hemoglobin A1C. It doesn't just control your weight. Your cholesterol, particularly your LDL, the dangerous cholesterol, it actually improves physical well-being, and what that leads to is less depression, better quality of life, better feeling of overall general health. And so we're talking about a disease that sort of pervades and takes over someone's life and ruins it in many ways that we can turn around with plant-based nutrition. Hopefully this is something that you will not experience, but most of you will at some point come to the United States, and you have to be careful of the junk food industry, and hopefully there's not too much of it out there. The high fructose corn syrup, cornstarch, vegetable shortening, yeah, they aren't animal products, but they aren't healthy either. And they're very inexpensive because of the subsidies that are given to manufacturers to make them. But they're not healthy at all. If you take a look at any of the data that looks at dietary factors and dying, heart attack, stroke, and diabetes, it's very clear that when you're eating a high sugar sweetened beverage or a sugar-filled diet, it increases mortality, along with high sodium. not eating enough nuts and seeds, having processed meat. I love this article showing the definition of high processed meat. Anybody in the front row tell me what is high? Greater than 0. That means any ever. Okay, so hopefully we can all. The biggest problem of processed red meats that I see now is medical meetings. You go to a cardiology meeting and that's what they're serving. So we need more fruits, more vegetables, no sugar sweetened beverages at 0, more grains, and if we do that, we can actually improve our dietary outcomes. We do have more susceptible, more data on diet that is more population-based. It's very sad that it's the African American population that I grew up in eating so-called soul food. They nicely call it the Southern diet, but I guess to you guys, everything in the United States is Southern, right? It's probably true because there's a lot of people all over, not just the South, who go to Harold's Fried Chickens and Popeyes and all of this stuff, and that kind of diet has pervaded the United States, adopted from the population that is the African American population that has the highest cardiovascular risk. So what happens? More heart disease, more kidney disease, more strokes, and more death. So hopefully we can try to change this pattern because it really is going all over the world. This was published a few months ago, and it's just very, very disheartening to see that if you look at health and diet across 195 countries, you see some dramatic patterns. That in 2017, if you look at a low intake of whole grains, high sodium, low intake of fruits, all of this these are ways of saying that you're eating more animal products and not getting calories from healthy vegetables. It's 11 million deaths. And 11 million deaths is one thing, but 255 disability-adjusted life years, people who are sick, people who can't go to work, people who have to be wheeled around by their family and taken to dialysis. I mean, this is really, it's more than an epidemic. It's threatening our planetary existence in a way. I'm going to switch over and talk about fat for a moment because we have a lot of folks nowadays talking about ketogenic diets and eating a lot of fat and a lot of meat and as a way to improve health. And they say they feel better and stronger and their diabetes went away. And I'm going to talk specifically about that, but the fat portion of it I want to clarify right now. The saturated fat, by every measure that's ever been looked at scientifically, increases heart attacks and mortality. And so this whole idea of butter is back, and the cover of Time magazine had this beautiful swab of butter, and people talking about the big fat surprise, it really doesn't jive with the data. And it may be an interesting trend that lasts for a while, and it increases, the business of cardiology at Rush University. So I probably shouldn't be complaining, but I am complaining because this is, these are human lives. So if you look at it carefully, saturated fat is to be avoided. Now we have even more data about removing trans fats, and this is something that Canada has done, Denmark. United States did it relatively late, but it's being enforced as of this year, that no one should be serving trans fats or cooking with trans fats in public places, restaurants, and the like. They are worse than saturated fat. And then monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fat actually are associated with lower mortality. You have some vegan diets, particularly the two of the famous ones, McDougall and Esselstyn, who will say no oil, no oil, no oil, even though the data says a decrease in mortality. Well, that decrease in mortality may in fact be a substitutionary benefit. That is, if people are eating monounsaturated fat, then they're not eating saturated fat. And the monounsaturated fat might be poison, but it's so much better than saturated fat that it comes out better. I like to make the analogy of if somebody's going to force you to take the cyanide or the arsenic, you take the arsenic, you'll live longer, right? Okay, all right. So, yeah, the numbers are about a 27% reduction in mortality for every 5% that you change from saturated to unsaturated fat. So we have an advisory from the American Heart Association basically saying the same thing, replace all your saturated fat with unsaturated fat. That basically are buzzwords for removing the animal products and putting in more vegetable products, and you will do so much better. It's really great to be in one of the handful of countries around the world where I don't have to lecture about how bad trans fats are in terms of what they do to the cholesterol, heart attack, stroke. And it was good to see the United States has joined that list. And they joined it based on this. This is not too far from you guys, right? Down south a little bit. The state of New York, where some counties were saying, we're going to do this, we're going to stop it. And what happened is you compare the stroke and heart attack rate in the areas that have cut the trans fats and those that haven't, and they are very different. So restricting, and people will say you're taking away my rights as a human to eat whatever I want. Well, we all have to make some rules, like stoplights. There's some good rules, and getting rid of trans fats, I think, is one of those good rules. Okay, I'm going to switch over and talk about cholesterol and inflammation for a little bit. So you may have heard that cholesterol is what plugs up arteries. That's very true. But so the way to think of it is that if cholesterol is loading the gun, that is, it's making the arteries full of plaque, then what pulls the trigger for cardiac events would be inflammation. And so people will try to measure their C-reactive protein or any other measure of inflammation and see how it goes. Well, it's interesting that when you're doing plant-based nutrition, you're not getting this chicken full of animal-laden diet with all the cholesterol. And people don't quite realize that that plants don't make cholesterol in substantial amount. They make plant sterols, and there are some chemical crossovers, but it's like in the nanograms. So please, if you're that person who sends me the email saying plants do make cholesterol, it's nanograms. Okay, that's like a billionth of a gram. So not to worry about them. So a lot of people are into egg whites because they are able to give you protein and not have to worry so much about cholesterol. The problem is most people are eating their egg whites with the egg yolk, and they really shouldn't if you're going to do that. Okay, so do we have any randomized trials on lowering cholesterol and C-reactive protein for inflammation? We really do. This came from Canada. This is David Jenkins at the University of Toronto. Published many years ago. It happened to be the month that I went vegan because my cholesterol was elevated, so thanks, David. It turns out that he did a study that stopped me from going on a statin because he tried a reasonably good diet with a statin, or just go on a vegan diet with plant sterols, soy protein, viscous fibers, and almonds. And the results were very striking. And that's exactly what happened to me personally. I got more like a 50% reduction in LDL rather than a 35%. And so the statin works, but so does the diet. On the C-reactive protein, ultimately the statin got there, but if you look at 2 weeks, the plant-based diet actually had a lower C-reactive protein. And so you could say that this really is an anti-inflammatory diet. We've had this for a while. Do you really want to take that picture? Okay, there it is. You got it? Okay. All right. So this is Benita Shah. Is actually an interventional cardiologist now, but she was so interested in nutrition and stopping, I guess she was stopping herself from having procedures to do later in her career by talking about doing vegan diet versus American Heart Association. And I'm not sure how she pulled this off. I saw her yesterday at another conference, and I started to ask her, how did you get the American Heart Association to publish an article against their own diet? But she did. It basically showed that the American Heart Association diet does not lower inflammation because it still has animal products, okay? And but if you do the vegan diet, you get a substantial reduction in inflammation as measured by the C-reactive protein. Okay, back to cholesterol for a moment, just so you can just get rid of that whole idea that you've heard over and over again, that eating cholesterol does not change your cholesterol. That is just not true. It is something that is put forward specifically by the Egg Board and the Cattlemen's Association in the United States. They do a lot of lobbying. They do a lot of sponsoring of trials, and they'll skew the trial to make sure that they come out on top. How would you do that? Well, take advantage of the limited ability of humans to absorb cholesterol. So all you have to do is have a diet that has 2 eggs, bacon, and ham, okay, and butter on the toast in the morning, okay, and then add another egg or two to it, and you won't see a change in the cholesterol because the absorption is already as high as it could possibly be. And so, and then you do the blood test before and after, adding the extra 2 eggs, and say, see, 2 eggs doesn't matter. No, that's not science. This is the real science. It was added up by Neil Barnard's group at the PCRM, and very clearly, with very little heterogeneity in terms of looking at all these studies, 30-something studies, the more plant-based nutrition you do, the lower the cholesterol. And these are all prospective interventional trials. And so you do get some people who have the response that I did with the 50, 60 point fall in cholesterol. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about eggs because they really have been marketed in the United States, the incredible edible egg, and it's really something that dietitians struggle with because they've been convinced by the egg board that eggs are good for you. But this was published a few months ago in the United States, and I always call my Journal of American Medical Association my vegan propaganda journal, but of course it isn't. They're very good authors submitting science as best they can, good reviewers, a very tough journal to get into, and editors. And so you can trust it when they show you a relationship like this, that the more eggs you eat, the more you die. There's reality to it, regardless of what the people with commercial interests have to say. So how low can you go for people who absolutely love their eggs? I would never do them personally, but each additional half an egg, if you have a study size that's only the 15,000 that they looked at, if you do it on 150,000 or increase the sample size, you'll probably see that that a smaller amount of eggs would actually reach statistical significance for increasing mortality. Okay, but probably the most important bottom line here was the concept that if you took the mathematical model for dying and you adjust it for the ingestion of cholesterol, there actually was no relationship between eggs and mortality, which means, perhaps it means that egg whites are okay. I personally wouldn't do it because there's still a concern that any type of animal protein would increase cancer through IGF-1 and other mechanisms. So I'm not sure that it's going to be safe, but at least in this model, egg whites got a pass. Okay. I am going to talk about that ketogenic diet. Atkins very secretly died of heart disease, and it was a difficult thing because so many people had heart attacks on the Atkins diet. One of them actually tried to put together a lawsuit. I don't know how it came out. I think it ended up getting sealed after Atkins had died, and someone leaked, because we have HIPAA laws, there's privacy laws. You're not supposed to tell what other people's illnesses are. But somehow the word that they said that he died on a parking lot hitting his head, but that was because he died and then he fell over. So it's a sad episode, but they somehow have been able to keep the plus side, which is the reduction in weight that does happen with a ketogenic diet in the forefront, and keep the fact that it increases death rate very, very quiet. And I don't know how, because the literature is replete with it. It didn't happen yesterday. I mean, well, it happened last week, but it didn't just happen recently. This is 2007 from Greece, where people were looking at a high intake of carbohydrates that were complex carbohydrates that actually lowered mortality. And if you did a low-carb diet, it increased mortality by about 22%. Now, the one that I have the most respect for is the people who put together the ERIC trial. Again, it's not a prospective, randomized trial. It's not. It's actually observational. You look at dietary questionnaires. You find out who's doing low-carb diet, how low-carb are they, and you put that data together with what happened to them. And the data was very clear. Big surprise, there's nothing wrong with a low-carb diet if you do it with plants, okay? So in green there, I didn't even know there was such a thing as a ketogenic or low-carb, plant-based diet, but it's vegetables, nuts, peanut butter, whole grain breads, olive oil. that sort of thing, as opposed to the usual lamb, beef, pork, chicken, more lard, more bacon. Those increased mortality. The data was actually very symmetrical, that if you took the average amount and you did plant-based, you actually had 18% decrease in mortality. That's a hazard ratio of 0.82. And if you did it with animals, you had an 18% increase in mortality. The curves are actually very convincing. And they did something unusual in this trial. That is, we don't want to just be out there by ourselves saying this. We're going to analyze all of the other data that's out there, and all of them. So their 18% was very close to the pooled result of similar studies, which said it was a 20% increase in death. Okay? One of them said a 75% increase in death, and I think I know how that happened. By the way, high-carb diets also are bad for you, but that's if they're refined carbs. Okay? So whoever's eating the white sugar, white rice, white flour, have to be very careful with that. Okay, so this actually came out in a couple of years ago, and it really showed that their analysis, and it did include some of the same studies, but they got about a 31% increase in mortality. Okay, and the one that I really wanted to focus on was published just a few weeks ago, and it said that low-carb diet for plant and animal sources increase death rate if you've had a heart attack. So this is something that no one with heart disease should be doing. Okay. And it's about a 53% increase in mortality. So what's wrong with the ketogenic diet as it's done in most places? It's actually red meat. Red meat kills. Processed red meat kills faster. It's dose-related, okay? And it's not just heart attack and stroke. It's actually heart failure, which is a growing epidemic around the world, particularly in the United States. And the more red meat you eat, the more heart failure deaths you have. I wanted to come back to the idea of fish, because so many people think that it's good for you. The problem with fish is that it, like really every animal protein, has been found in 2 studies that I'm going to show you to have increased mortality. So this is pretty easy to understand. That vertical line means that if you're to the right of it, animals are safer, and if you're to the left of it, vegetables are safer. And then it tells you how much. And so if I blow it up again, processed red meat should never be eaten by anyone, but that's probably true of all animal products because all of them increase mortality. It's just that poultry, fish, and dairy are a little bit less murderous than eggs, red meat, and processed red meat. So anyway, you're not having deja vu. That article was from 2016. This one was from 2 weeks ago. Same journal, same title. And it's not exactly the same result. It actually came from Japan. And in Japan, it turns out that the eggs were safer than red meat. Okay? But we're talking about varying degrees of dying. So it's like, but other than the fact that they flip-flopped the order between eggs and unprocessed red meat, there was not much of a difference. Okay. So why did fish get in our guidelines? Because there is a randomized prospective trial showing a 30% reduction of heart attack, stroke, and death. That is the Mediterranean diet, where you substitute your red meat for fish mostly and some white meat. And as it turns out, that was great, except it doesn't lower cholesterol, it doesn't lower heart attacks, and it did not lower death. And so decreasing stroke is probably a good thing, but it's not what we're looking for. And so I hope everybody takes that away, that there has been a prospective trial, and they showed this, that if you did a vegetarian Mediterranean diet, you actually did show a mortality benefit, and it was actually very large, about a 42% reduction in death if you just stop eating all the animals, not just the fish, or not just the red meat. I'm going to mention protein just for a moment because so many people think that vegetables don't have protein. They do. Chicken, beef, pork, well, beef and peanuts are about the same. Egg whites, eating those for protein is not as good as quinoa, and soybeans and lentils actually beat all of them above. Why not do animals? Because of this. And if you don't take anything else away from what I'm saying today, okay, if we can have 2 extra minutes, 2, please, 2, okay. It's TMAO. So yeah, I need my 2 minutes back from where that other thing was going on. Okay. Because this is what I'd like everybody to hear. This is the New England Journal of Medicine, Cleveland Clinic, talking about trimethylamine N oxide. You eat animal products, it goes into your gut, changes your gut flora. Your gut flora then make this chemical trimethylamine, which then becomes in your liver trimethylamine N oxide. I hope everyone's heard about this, and anyone who hears about it stops eating animals immediately, because there is a unique relationship between heart attack, stroke, and death, and heart failure if you have the high level of trimethylamine N oxide. It actually, beautiful studies of how it works, causing more plaque, causing plaques to rupture, causing, in this case, it's showing you the stickiness of platelets. And so those platelets get very, very sticky. There's your heart failure data. The more heart failure you have, or the more TMA you have, the more heart failure death. And so eating a plant-based diet really can lower heart failure risk, and that was shown by Kyla Lara using the regards data. Okay, so in my last 2 minutes, the hazards of eating red meat actually has been really well characterized in the literature. 450 articles in 2015. People are still eating it, hard to imagine. If it wasn't for the diabetes, the strokes, the heart attack, and the heart failure, it'd be great. This complicated slide, you might want to snap a picture, but it boils down to all the things that happen when you eat red meat. And I've talked about on the left side, the TMAO, but the other one to mention here is heme iron. If you're eating the blood of an animal, you're getting an oxidative stress that was pointed out by our National Institutes of Health, producing so-called reactive oxygen species, which damages arteries and damages plaque. You should be getting your iron from plants so that you don't make plaque and then upset the foam cells inside of it and get heart attacks and strokes. So there was something published a couple of days ago that said that if you were a vegetarian, you had more strokes. It's one of the worst pieces of statistical modeling I'd ever seen, so I thought I would mention it because people are going to ask you about it. But doesn't it mean I'm going to get a stroke? No. What happened is the absolute numbers, if you did the ratios, the numbers were less in vegetarians. But their model was supposed to adjust for risk factors. So if the blood pressure was accounted for and the blood pressure in vegetarians is lower, and then you adjust for that, it flips it over, and you say, per millimeter of mercury, vegetarians have more stroke, but they had less stroke. So just want to get rid of that. My final note is to remember, for those of you who do have coronary disease, it doesn't have to be a permanent condition. We've known for decades that you can lower your cholesterol, whether it's statins, vegan diet, PCSK9 inhibitors, all of them, including the Ornish diet, can lower the amount of plaque, improve the nuclear scans, get the amount of narrowing to go away, and both Ornish and Esselstyn have proved that not only with scanning, but with that direct angiograms. Okay, so my summary would be this, that we have an opportunity to get rid of the obesity, diabetes, hypertension, the lipid problems, peripheral artery disease, erectile dysfunction, heart attack, heart failure, stroke, and death, all with just one manipulation, and that would be to change our diets. There really are no safe animal products, and people really didn't like that 2016 article in JAMA. And when the second one was published with the identical title, pretty much identical result from a completely different country, at that point they don't know what to say. I'm hoping that we will be able to really push this agenda forward and get people to change their lifestyles so we don't have to do so much treating of disease after the fact. Okay, so I'm looking over. Can I have another 60 seconds, just 60 seconds? 1 minute, 1 minute. I do have something else to say. Whenever I'm in a lay audience, that is the end of my talk, but how many doctors do we have here? Okay, great. And how many nurses? Okay, so the majority of people are not healthcare workers? Okay, so I just have 1 minute, okay? I'm sorry, okay. And that is your doctor doesn't know all this, okay? Your doctor is trained in a situation where nutrition is not given to them. And if you don't go back to your doctor and tell them, they're going to be one of those many people who have 0 or 1% of the physicians knowing something about nutrition education. And so I am on a personal quest because my friends in cardiology are dying of heart disease. Okay? This is a good friend of mine, John Warner, had 2 heart attacks, or has had sudden death twice and had to be resuscitated. He's doing okay now, but not so much for, that was the American Heart Association president. The Interventional Society president died on his lawnmower. There was nobody there. And so this is a personal request that you would go out, every time you go to a doctor, bring them something about plant-based nutrition, what it's done for you, what it's done from other people that you know. Please support our journal. It's relatively new. It has all the literature that you need to try and go back to your doctor and educate them about how to save their life and their patient's life. Was that okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.